Well, if you've been following the news, the world has Ukraine on the brain, and, perhaps rightfully so. But I got to be honest with you, I don't think anybody saw coming what has happened in the last few days. And even now, today, as I'm recording this, we're learning that President Trump has decided to put an end to any and all future aid to Ukraine. And I don't think Zelensky knew what he was doing when he walked in the White House. Not at all. Look, let's step back for a minute. I looked back in the Rightside archives to see what I had been saying this time 3 years ago. Back in February of 2022, with Russia invading Ukraine. Now, set aside how you feel about Zelensky, or even Putin for that matter. And really, set aside how you feel about Trump. Sit back and look objectively at where we are today. In the war that was said to be only capable of lasting 1 to 2 weeks, we're now at 3 years and 1 month. And I'm going to say up front, hear me on this. It is possible to be opposed to Zelensky in his role as president of Ukraine and still want Russia to lose. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. It is possible to, and makes good sense actually, to be opposed to what we have seen in recent days, especially with Zelensky's leadership in Ukraine, and still also want Putin to be dealt with harshly. But more than anything, there needs to be a push for peace. Because the economies, the securities, the well-being of Europe is of a direct vital national interest to the United States, and don't think for a second it's not. We need them to get their collective act together. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to lay it out for you. How did we go from being opposed to Russia invading Ukraine to having the president of Ukraine asked to leave the White House? It's really a question of leadership. And let's be honest, Zelensky screwed this up royally. He has failed to grasp that 2025 is not 2022. Times change, sentiments change, economics change, presidents change, and in many ways, the world has changed a great deal in 3 years. Now, having said all that, let's think about where we've been. Because back in 2014, a little over 10 years ago, the Obama-Biden administration stood idly by without saying a word when Putin's Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula. And when that happened, think about this. Ukraine lost 2.4 million of its citizens and one of the strongest Black Sea ports in the city of Sevastopol. But Putin, he wanted more. And many believe, and I agree, that if Trump had not been elected in 2016, Putin may well have moved on the rest of Ukraine much earlier, but he didn't. He knew that Trump was not Obama or Clinton. He knew that Biden was different, and then he got Joe Biden. And the most reckless, feckless, toothless foreign policy in the history of the United States came into office. So toward the end of Biden's first year, Putin launched into eastern Ukraine. But let's not forget a few things in the process. Back in February of 2022, Russian forces launched a three-pronged attack with tens of thousands of ground forces that were preceded by hundreds of cruise missile strikes, airstrikes, attack helicopter runs, but reports surfaced almost immediately. The Ukrainian forces, who have always been vastly outnumbered and outgunned, they fought back and have made sure that a Russian invasion on their sovereign soil was not going to go down without some Russian blood being shed in the process. As of March of 2025, this year, while I'm recording this, estimates are that nearly 500,000 casualties have been inflicted on both sides. But the overwhelming majority of them have been Russians, with nearly 300,000 dead and wounded. Even still, though, it appears that Russian forces have been able to steadily advance across Ukraine, taking out key command and control nodes, destroying Ukrainian military bases, razing whole cities on the eastern side of Ukraine, especially in the Donbass region. Cyber attacks in Ukraine have disrupted Ukrainian banking, communications, government offices. Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, who I respect immensely, who is now an envoy for the Trump administration, he said back in 2022 that Putin appeared to be somewhat unhinged, and that we should know that he, Putin, has openly threatened the United States and NATO and our allies around the world that, in his words, General Kellogg believes, was a couched threat for the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Not the nation-killing kind, but certainly the kind that can destroy whole installations and units and infrastructure. Other analysts have said that the U.S. should be braced for potential cyber attacks on key nodes within our own United States. If all cell phones, banking, government functions, GPS capability, if all of that suddenly went down, modern society as we know it would go dark. Well, the Biden administration had the helm. They had the options. They allegedly had the intelligence and the clout and the ability to address the issue. But when asked what the official Biden foreign policy would be from the U.S. to Russia prior to the invasion, Biden said one word: don't. That's it. Just don't. Which apparently meant nothing because he did. You may also recall, too, that Biden at one point was asked about what would happen if Russia invaded as they were building up their troops. His response was, well, it would matter like what size of an invasion it was. Who says that? Look, there are things that could have been done. I'll rehash them just for a minute to give some perspective, and then I'll move forward. So first and foremost, I will reiterate that despite my personal background as a warfighter, I do not want to see U.S. troops on Ukrainian soil. Do not. Period. But what has been forgotten in the several years since it started is that initially Putin went so far as to say that not only did he question the validity of Ukraine's statehood, he also questioned certain sections of Poland. Well, Poland's a NATO ally, and that can't be allowed to happen. NATO has to remain intact and strong. That's one thing. And I believe that Biden put it on the thread of moving towards negatives and moving towards the ability for Putin to fracture NATO. And here we are today. Sanctions, I agree with sanctions, but they can't be escalating a little bit here and a little bit there and threatening only. Biden should have unequivocally dropped the sanctions hammer when he had the chance. Putin was already threatening us. He'd already committed acts of war on an ally. He was already hostile. So drop the hammer in such a way that he cannot do business. Cut him out of the SWIFT banking system so he can't move money around and conduct international trade. Don't play. Do it. Do it hard. But Biden didn't do that. And Putin felt somewhat empowered. That's two. Cyber attacks? Well, cyber attacks on Russian infrastructure. Those were an option that were definitely on the table. Still could be. At any given time, we could have turned out the lights in key locations around Russia so the populace would know that they can be touched. Already, we're seeing protests in Russia as members of the populace don't agree with Putin's war. They don't want their sons and daughters dying any more than we do. So make sure they know that we can reach them. That's three. But something else the Biden administration refused to do that would have been very effective would have been to rescind Biden's executive orders that curtailed our own domestic energy production here in the U.S. We should have allowed the oil and gas industry to fully rekindle. Get the West away from any dependency on Russian oil or imports of any type. We can control our own energy destiny, and then Russia should not be the ones dictating world commodity prices, and Russia's war machine right now is fueled in large part by its own energy production to Western states. That's four. I'll tell you what Biden did do, though. What did he do? What he did do was write checks. So here in 2025, the United States has entered into an era of big government accountability and the advent of DOGE. We're relishing the idea right now as conservatives, who, by the way, overwhelmingly won the election. We're relishing the idea of finding and cutting wasteful spending. But that public sentiment for DOGE politics, it's built on the haphazard and mindless way that the Biden administration spent trillions of dollars just wantonly. And one of those egregious line items in the Biden profit and loss statement was Ukraine. Not because we shouldn't have helped, but because Biden had no plan, no accountability. Where in the history of the world has there ever been a time when the checkbook was laid open for international aid with no understanding or expectation of accountability? What was the plan? There was no plan. All we ever heard from the Biden camp was, we're in it for as long as it takes. Well, the United States spent hundreds of billions of dollars, and we can't say where or how. To be sure, I believe much of it's going to wind up being traceable. Many American companies actually benefited. But the real point is this. The war had no end state. It had no milestones. It had no phase lines. We were just fueling it. And all it had was an unsustainable, unrealistic expense line in the U.S. economy, which had American taxpayers paying out over 25% more than all of the European nations combined. Now, fast forward to where we are. Last week, Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine, came to the White House. Now, there's been a lot of talk about what he wore. He came in wearing the sweatshirt, and I get it. You know what? If a foreign leader from Nepal or from India or from an African nation came in wearing their native garb, we wouldn't say boo about it. We wouldn't expect them to dress Western because they're not. But I will say this. Zelensky is Western. He has always worn a suit, and he knows he's on the world stage right now. And he came into the Oval Office for the second time wearing a sweatshirt. He says it was a commitment he made to his people that as a wartime commander, he would wear combatant commander clothes. Okay. Times change. Maybe on the world stage, it's time for him to take on the persona of being someone who respects the office of the people with whom he is meeting and asking for aid. But that was just one example. The bottom line is Zelensky failed to read the room on this one at all. He's the elected leader of a sovereign nation, and I respect that, but for being in his position, he failed to recognize that the mood has changed dramatically in the U.S. Leadership has changed. Public sentiment has changed. And therefore, his position has actually changed. He came to the White House, and what we're learning now is he had options, but he chose not to take them. Literally a week or more before the blow-up in the Oval Office, Secretary Rubio sat down with investigative journalist Catherine Herridge and said that Zelensky was becoming increasingly difficult to deal with. That was before the Oval Office. Rubio said that they were talking, one way behind closed doors, and he would say something in negotiations, and then he'd do another when he left the room. Rumors abound right now, too, that Zelensky may have been taking advice from Democrats and from former Obama and Biden advisors Susan Rice and Alexander Vindman, of all people. If that's true, if he was taking advice from people who are diametrically opposed to the man from whom he is trying to gain something, then it indicates an extreme naivety on his part. I mean, why would you do that? Why would you go to the people who hate the one that you're meeting with, who you need something from, and say, tell me how to work with him? What are they going to say? They're going to do everything they can to undermine it. And they did. The truth is, in reality, Ukraine is now better armed than most of the European nations. But Zelensky will never be in NATO at this point. Ukraine is not going to be a NATO country. And not just because of the U.S. Nobody wants Ukraine in NATO in reality, because that would mean an immediate advancement of the war into a global conflict. But it's also not likely that Ukraine is going to get its territories back completely. I mean, we're 10 years now removed from Obama letting the Crimean Peninsula go. Putin's going to wind up keeping Crimea at this point. The question is, can we negotiate a peace that sees Russia withdrawing from eastern portions of Ukraine? Even then, there's going to have to be European-led peacekeeping forces. But here's the other thing. They don't all want to be a part of that. Prime Minister of Great Britain said yesterday, I believe it was, that he is forming what he calls a coalition of the willing. Keir Starmer said he's forming a coalition of the willing. You know who that is right now? That's a bunch of people that did a photo op, but when they were asked if they'd send troops, it's basically France and Great Britain right now. France and Great Britain. We're hearing that Poland and Germany and Italy have all said they want no part in that. They don't want to put their boots on the ground. So a coalition of the willing really means they're throwing a party and very few people RSVP'd. That's what it means. Zelensky's best option for peace may be the one he just walked away from. Because in the absence of being a NATO nation, in the absence of having all of Europe joined together with him, in the absence of all the protections that would otherwise entail, Zelensky could have well had the covering of a vital national interest of the U.S. being right there inside of his borders. We were looking to sign a massive multi-billion-dollar mineral agreement that would have allowed the U.S. to help develop Ukraine's massive rare earth mineral deposits. And let's be honest, everybody knows Putin didn't invade just because he was scared of NATO being on his border. He already had a buffer. Ukraine was a buffer. But the reality is this: Putin wanted what he saw across the border. He knew the assets and the resources that Ukraine had. It's the breadbasket of Eastern Germany. The agricultural industry there is strong. It's an energy producer. And oh, by the way, it had warm water ports in the Black Sea. And oh, by the way, it had massive mineral deposits. Putin wanted those resources. But if they're under contract with the U.S., then Putin can be told to back off of those territories, because now the U.S. plans to have an economic interest there, and you don't mess with our stuff. Well, Zelensky hosed himself and he hosed his people by playing games with the issue and then trying to school President Trump and Vice President Vance in the Oval Office. It was an ill-fated move. It remains to be seen whether the deal is now defunct. We're hearing right now, even this morning, reports are that Ukrainian authorities, some of whom are calling for Zelensky's resignation, or maybe his impeachment, that some of the others are also saying, we're working behind the scenes, we're going to get this back on track. Well, that deal would mean hundreds of billions of dollars to the Ukrainian economy for the purpose of rebuilding and restoring the ravages of war, and the bullets would also stop flying. Look, Zelensky came in with an attitude. He did. He came in with an attitude. He felt like he had been in some way maligned, and truthfully, some of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration probably provoked some of that. But Zelensky should have looked at Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, because Netanyahu was constantly being misled and mistreated by the Biden administration. But Netanyahu knew not to air the dirty laundry in the eyes of the world. He came in and he had an attitude of, I'll work with you, and then he did what he had to do when he left. By trying to puff up to Trump in the Oval Office, Zelensky lost everything in the eyes of the world. Netanyahu, he kept his professionalism intact, kept a poker face, and he did quite fine. Historian and commentator Victor Davis Hanson, he pointed out, and I quote this, quote, that March 2025 is not March 2022. After the heroic saving of Kyiv, but 3 years later and 1.5 million dead and wounded, Zelensky is no longer the international heartthrob with a glamorous entourage. He said he has postponed elections, outlawed opposition media and parties, suspended habeas corpus, walked out of negotiations when he had an even hand in the spring of 2022, and apparently even now when he does not have it in the spring of 2025. Look, here's the bottom line. I have no sympathy, me personally, I have no sympathy for Zelensky as a leader, but I have immense sympathy for the Ukrainian people. They have been bludgeoned and beaten in all of this. There are whole sections of Ukraine right now that are devastated, and their economy has taken major hits. But I will also say that in the face of the so-called Great Russian Bear, Ukrainian soldiers, they've been putting the wood to the big scary neighbor to the east. But their leadership needs to change. Either it needs to change its posture or it needs to change its politics. But the bottom line is Ukrainian leadership is going to have to change because 2025 is not 2022. So where do we go from here? What's next in the storyline? I'm going to tell you that I am of the firm belief that the war in Ukraine is still one of the biggest stories in the decade. It's the largest forced-on-force, continuous conventional warfare on European soil since World War II, really, maybe even in the world. And the ramifications of what happens now and what happens next are immense. And we have to be keenly aware of the potential for a broadening of the conflict, a flashpoint that could possibly suck us in. Look, I'm a big fan of history, right? I like studying the ways of generations before me. I especially like knowing the history of wherever I happen to be standing at any given time. And I have been a keen follower of contemporary military history since I was a teenager. So I recently had to sit down and review some of the sequencing of events, though, that led up to the onset of the two most epic wars in the history of the world, and it's sobering. Because they all dealt with flashpoints. Flashpoints in which people thought negotiations were working, when people were trying to stay out of it, and then all of a sudden something happened because peace couldn't be found yet, and a flashpoint brewed up over time, and then flashed into wars into existence in quick fashion. And we ought to take heed. I mean, as I read over historical analysis of the two world wars, I'm struck by how much I can see in those events that seem to mirror, almost with a sense of similarity, the events that we're watching unfold right now. I mean, let's try this as a dry run. If I was to say to you, feckless Western leadership emboldened the militaristic socialist leader of the re-emerging powers in Europe, would you think I was talking about the days leading up to World War II, or the days that we're in now where Biden was in office and Russia did not feel at all threatened to invade Ukraine? Exactly. The statement fits both. You can apply that phrase equally to then and now. How about this one? European alliances pledged their support to one another in posturing manners that nonetheless failed to stem the rising tide of war. Would that be the lead up to World War I? Or our situation now in Eastern Europe where the coalition of the willing is not that willing? I'll go one more time. How about this one? The U.S. government warned its citizens to avoid exposure to certain regions in Europe, but the U.S. government also made clear it did not see a U.S. national interest in the burgeoning European conflicts and therefore did not intend to put U.S. troops in harm's way. Sound familiar? I mean, that's related to today, right? I mean, it could be. It's also a very apt description of the days prior to any U.S. entry in World War I. Look, I made up all those phrases while picturing the thens and the nows in relation to conflicts in Europe. But understand me when I say this. I do not want U.S. troops in harm's way anywhere, much less in a broad-scale conventional fight with a true adversary like Russia. My concern, though, is that history dictates that rarely has broad conflict in Europe remained a non-issue for the North American continent. The Atlantic Ocean is no real barrier, it seems, when Europe explodes. It always seems to follow certain patterns. Cross-border rivalries, ethnic identities that transcend borders, aggressive posturing by a domineering political figure, and then an incident occurs, a flashpoint that lights up a short fuse on a powder keg, always coupled, it seems, by some measure of feckless leadership, believing that it can just reason with the tyrant. It's going to be fine. Only to find out the tyrant cannot be trusted, because deceitfulness is in the very nature of all tyrants. That's exactly why President Trump is right to forge a peacemaking deal. Not peacekeeping, but a peacemaking deal. Our national interests as the United States are best served by peace, actual peace, in Europe. Because war in Europe rarely stays just in Europe. So in the months leading up to World War I, a clash of alliances was set in motion. At that point, you had Austria-Hungary and Germany aligned on one side, England, France, Ireland, Russia on the other, and then Archduke Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated by a Serbian terrorist, and Austria-Hungary threatened war. And then Russia came to the aid of Serbia, causing France and England to stake their ground in the fight as well. And Germany marched to France, and England got in the fight. Meanwhile, the United States determined it was just not our fight. Warnings were issued. U.S. citizens should avoid travel. And then the Germans began an unfettered attack on the shipping lanes and sunk the cruise liner Lusitania with 128 Americans on board, among the 1,200 who died. And all of a sudden, U.S. passions were inflamed. It was a flashpoint. And political speeches became more hawkish. And soon there were scores of American soldiers in trenches in the Great War over there. The lead up to World War II, it was equally ominously familiar. It was Hitler determining to cause Germany to reemerge from the ashes of its downfall in World War I. And the rest of Europe stood idly by, hoping they would not be drawn in. And Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, the Biden of yesteryear, tried to appease the opposition, tried to appease Hitler. He literally worked to find any way possible to make Hitler happy, to mitigate his concerns, and yet Europe watched while Hitler grew his war machine and annexed Austria, much like Putin annexed Crimea. Hitler's new war machine then fought a proxy war in the Spanish Civil War to test some of their new weapon systems. And Europe stood by because it was just Austria. He won't come here, will he? He wouldn't do that, would he? And yet he did. Because nobody worked to make peace, real peace, by using strength when they had the opportunity. You've all heard the old axiom that if we do not study our history, we're doomed to repeat it. Well, everything I just described to you could simply have the names changed and be applied to the current events unfolding before our very eyes. A re-emerging world power, hungry for the glory days, seeking to flex its muscles under the leadership of a ruthless dictator, a dictator who feels no shame in declaring that the sovereign territory of his neighboring countries need to be his, and a feckless leadership like Joe Biden who watched and hoped and wrung his bony hands with the hope this thing would go away. Appeasement would actually work. But it doesn't. What works is strength. What works is the big stick behind the soft words. What works is when you try to make peace by forcing people to the table to negotiate something they might not negotiate on their own. Again, I don't want my family and friends who are currently serving in the military to start moving towards a European conflict. I do not. I will tell you this, though, with all measure of sincerity, we had better take it seriously. We better not draw silly red lines in the sand with no intention of following through. We had better not get into a reclusive, isolationist mindset and forget that ensuring our best defense may mean some measure of force protection and force projection. The bottom line is there's an old axiom that dates to the 4th century in Rome, sivi pacem para bellum. It means if you want peace, you prepare for war. That's how you do peace, through strength. We will prepare accordingly. The world is not a stable place. Europe is threadbare in some ways. Russia is desperate. And China, by the way, is on the horizon. We have no choice but to more fully prepare. But President Trump was absolutely right to push for peace in Ukraine because peace in Ukraine actually benefits the U.S. It does. That's a view of today. But it's also a view of history. And the knowledge that one cannot enter into a playground filled up with bullies and come out okay unless the bullies know you carry a big stick. History is replete with obvious parallels to where we are now. Let's just hope that history does not repeat itself. We need peace in Ukraine. That's my philosophy.